The wind was a blade. It sliced through the worn wool of her cloak, through the thin fabric of her tunic, and sank its teeth into her bones. Alara huddled against the trunk of a skeletal pine, her body one long, violent shiver. This far north, cold was not merely a sensation, it was a predator. For 5 years, she had survived it. 5 years since they had burned the brand into the back of her neck and cast her out into the blighted woods. Witch, they had called her. The word had been a stone, thrown hard enough to shatter her world. All because a child had taken a fever, and she had been the one to offer a poultice of willow bark. When the boy died, their fear needed a name, and hers had been the easiest to speak. Her cabin was a league behind her now, its weak timbers likely groaning under the weight of this unnatural snow. The storm had come without warning, a white wall that had devoured the world. Her last few logs were gone, her food stores dwindling to a handful of dried berries. Staying meant freezing to death. Fleeing meant, well, it likely meant the same thing, just with a different view. But a flicker of defiance, stubborn and small, still burned inside her. It was all she had left. She would not die in that miserable hut they had allowed her as a final, cruel mercy. She would die walking. Her fingers were numb, clumsy things she could barely command. Her vision was blurring at the edges, the endless white of the blizzard punctuated by dark, swimming spots. She stumbled, her worn boot catching on a hidden root. The fall was slow, almost gentle, as the deep snow cushioned her impact. Lying there, with snowflakes melting on her eyelashes, it would have been so easy to close her eyes, to just let the cold take her. It promised a kind of peace, a quiet end to a life of noise and pain. But then she smelled it. Smoke. Faint. Almost lost in the howling wind, but undeniably there. Wood smoke. Hope was a foolish, dangerous thing, but it shot through her veins like lightning. She pushed herself up, her muscles screaming in protest. She forced her legs to move, one agonizing step after another, following the phantom scent. The trees grew thicker here, their ancient branches heavy with snow, creating a strange, hushed corridor that offered some respite from the wind. The smell of smoke grew stronger, mingling with the scent of pine and something else. Something musky and wild. Animal. A dark shape loomed ahead, a jagged fissure in the face of a granite cliff. A cave. Smoke curled from its mouth like a ghostly breath. A part of her screamed a warning. This was the heart of the woods, a place where things much older and more dangerous than common wolves were said to roam. But the alternative was the certain freezing death at her back. She chose the unknown monster over the familiar one. Alara crept toward the entrance, every nerve ending alight with fear. The warmth that radiated from within was a siren's call. She peered inside. The cave was deep, its walls glittering with ice crystals that reflected the light of a small, steady fire burning in a ring of stones. And beside the fire lay the beast. It was a wolf. But it was like no wolf she had ever seen. It was enormous, its shoulders as high as a man's waist. Its fur was the color of silver forged in moonlight, thick and pristine. It lay with its head on its paws, amber eyes watching the flames, seemingly oblivious to her presence. This was no mere animal. This was a creature of legend, a dire wolf, the companions of the Alpha Kings. The stories said they were the king's own soul given form. Fear warred with a desperate, bone-deep exhaustion. She should run, but her legs would not obey. The warmth was pulling her in, unraveling the last of her strength. She took one step into the cave and then another. The world tilted, the firelight spinning into a dizzying smear of orange and gold. Her knees buckled. She hit the stone floor with a dull thud, her last coherent thought one of bitter irony, to have survived the judgment of men only to be eaten by a myth, Consciousness returned, not as a rush, but as a slow, gentle tide. The first thing she noticed was warmth. Not just the ambient heat of the cave, but a solid, living warmth pressed against her back. The second was the weight. Something heavy and soft was draped over her. Ilara's eyes fluttered open. She was lying on her side, inches from the fire, which now burned brighter than before. The heavy weight was her own cloak, which she had thought lost in her fall. The warmth at her back was the wolf. Panic seized her, cold and sharp. She froze, not daring to breathe. The massive creature was curled behind her, its immense body a living wall of heat. She could feel the slow, steady rhythm of its breathing. It hadn't killed her. It had tucked her in? It made no sense. Her mind, sluggish with cold and confusion, couldn't process it. She lay perfectly still, listening to the crackle of the fire and the soft sigh of the beast's breath. Slowly, cautiously, she turned her head. Two amber eyes met hers. There was no malice in them, no hunger, only a deep, ancient intelligence and something that looked unnervingly like curiosity. The wolf did not move, save for a slight twitch of its ear. It simply watched her. The moment was shattered by a new presence. A figure blocked the cave entrance, a silhouette against the raging white storm. He was impossibly tall, broad-shouldered, his form radiating a power that felt as vast and merciless as the winter itself. The cold that clung to him was different from the storms. This was an intrinsic cold, a frost that lived in the soul. He stepped into the firelight and Ilara's breath caught in her throat. It was the Alpha King, Kaelin. She had seen drawings of him, of course. The Wolf King of the North, ruler of the Icelands. But the sketches had been pale imitations. His face was all harsh lines and brutal beauty, framed by a mane of silver hair that matched the wolf's pelt. His eyes were the color of a frozen sky, pale and piercing. They swept the cave, taking in the scene with an expression of utter disbelief. His gaze landed on her, a branded, half-frozen nobody huddled by his fire. But his shock wasn't for her. It was for the beast at her back. Kale. The king's voice was a low rumble, like stones grinding together deep underground. The wolf, Kyle, lifted its head. It gave a soft whine, then did something that made the king take a half-step back. It nudged Ilara's shoulder with its great nose, a gesture of clear, unambiguous possessiveness. Ilara saw the king's knuckles turn white where he clenched his fists. She saw the storm in his eyes, a maelstrom of confusion and something else. Something she couldn't name. "What have you done?" he asked, his voice dangerously quiet. The question was not directed at her. It was for the wolf. She tried to scramble away, to put distance between herself and these two terrifying forces of nature. But her limbs were still weak, uncooperative. She could only manage to push herself into a sitting position, clutching her ragged cloak around her. The brand on her neck felt like it was burning. The king's ice-blue eyes finally focused on her, truly seeing her. He saw the rags, the exhaustion, the fear. And then his gaze drifted to the back of her neck, where a wisp of hair had fallen away. He saw the ugly, puckered scar of the brand. His expression tightened, becoming an unreadable mask of stone. "You are in exile," he stated. It was not a question. "Yes, Your Majesty," she whispered, her voice hoarse. Her mind screamed at her to be silent, to be invisible. But the words came out anyway. He ignored her answer. His attention was locked on his wolf, who had now moved to sit between Ilara and the king, a silent silver guardian. Ilara had heard the stories. For 10 years, the king's dire wolf had been his shadow, a silent, listless creature that never left his side, that showed no interest in man or beast. A reflection of the king's own frozen heart, the whispers said. And now, that same wolf was actively shielding a branded witch from its master. "The storm will not break for days," the king said, his voice flat, devoid of emotion. "You cannot stay here, and you will not survive out there." He looked at her, then back at the wolf. A muscle worked in his jaw. It was clear he was fighting some internal battle, the outcome of which would decide her fate. "You will come with me," he said at last. The words were not an invitation. They were a command, a sentence. And Alara, caught between the storm, the wolf, and the king, had no choice but to obey. The fortress was a spike of black stone driven into the heart of the mountain, a place that seemed to command the winter around it. It was as cold and unforgiving as its master. Guards in dark furs and steel bowed their heads as Kalen swept past, his silver wolf at his heels. Alara trailed behind, a ghost in his wake, feeling the weight of 100 disbelieving stares. He led her not to the dungeons, as she had expected, but to a small, sparse room in the servants' wing. It contained a narrow cot, a wash basin, and a single high window that looked out onto the blizzard. "You will remain here," he said, his back to her. "You will be given food. When the storm abates, you will be gone." It was a reprieve, but it felt like a cage. "Thank you, Your Majesty," she murmured to his unmoving back. He turned, his pale eyes pinning her to the spot. "Do not thank me. I do this for him." He gestured with his chin toward the wolf. Kale had entered the room and, instead of following his master out, had walked directly to the thin rug beside her cot and laid down with a sigh. The king's face was a study in controlled fury. "He has not left my side in a decade," he said, his voice tight. "Not for a single night." Alara could only stare, her heart hammering against her ribs. She had no explanation. She was as mystified as he was. "Stay out of sight," he commanded. "Do not speak to anyone unless you must. You are a servant here. Nothing more." He turned and left, the heavy wooden door closing with a definitive thud, leaving her alone with the king's soul. The days that followed were a strange purgatory. She was given simple tasks: mending linens, polishing silver, peeling vegetables in the cavernous kitchens. The other servants gave her a wide berth, whispering behind their hands about the branded woman who had bewitched the king's wolf. Their fear was a palpable thing, a wall she couldn't breach even if she had wanted to. But she was never truly alone. Kyle was her constant shadow. He followed her through the cold stone corridors, waiting patiently outside the laundry while she worked, his silent presence a bizarre comfort. At night, he slept on the rug by her bed, a warm, breathing mountain of silver fur. The king did not summon her, but he came to her. The first time he appeared at her door late at night, a dark shape in the flickering torchlight of the hall. He said he was there to see the wolf. He stood in the doorway, his arms crossed over his massive chest, and simply watched Kale sleep. He did not speak to her, and she did not dare speak to him. After a long, tense silence, he left. He came again the next night. This time he stepped inside. "He seems calmer," the king observed, his voice a low rumble. "He is very peaceful, sire," she whispered, perched on the edge of her cot. The king's gaze shifted to her. "Why?" The question was abrupt, demanding. I don't know, Your Majesty." "Do not lie to me, witch." The word was cold, sharp, but it lacked the venom she was used to. It was a statement of fact, not an accusation. "I am not lying," she said, her own voice surprising her with its steadiness. "I have done nothing. I am as lost as you are." Something in her honesty seemed to disarm him. He looked from her to the wolf and back again. He saw the mending basket in her lap, her fingers, red and chapped from lye soap, carefully stitching a seam. "Your hands," he said, his eyes narrowing. "They are raw." She quickly hid them in the folds of her woolen skirt. It is nothing, sire. He left without another word. The next morning, a small pot of soothing salve was sitting outside her door. There was no note. It could have been from anyone, but she knew. His nightly visits became a ritual. He would appear at her door, a silent, brooding presence. At first, he spoke only of the wolf. But then, the questions began to change. He asked about her exile. He did not ask if she was guilty. He asked what they had accused her of. She told him, her voice quiet in the small room. She told him about the sick child, the willow bark, the fear in the villagers' eyes. She told him about the magistrate with the cold, clever face who had pronounced her sentence without a hint of doubt. She spoke of the brand, of the searing pain, but more than that, of the shame that had been burned into her soul along with her flesh. He listened. He never spoke of his own life, of his own coldness, but she could see it in him. She saw a loneliness so profound it had frozen him from the inside out. He was a king, surrounded by a court, yet he was more alone than she had ever been in her isolated cabin. One night, he found her shivering, a thin blanket wrapped around her shoulders. The wind had found a new crack in the stone wall, and the draft was relentless. He said nothing, but his eyes lingered on her trembling form. He left, and she assumed their strange meeting was over. He returned minutes later with a thick fur blanket from his own chambers. It was heavy and smelled of pine and winter and him. He laid it over her cot. "A servant of the citadel should not freeze," he said, his tone clipped, formal. But his eyes told a different story. "Thank you," she whispered, her fingers sinking into the impossibly soft fur. "The wolf needs you warm," he deflected, turning to leave. "He is not the only one," she said, the words slipping out before she could stop them. Kalen froze in the doorway, his back to her. For a long moment he didn't move. Then, without turning, he walked away, the sound of his boots echoing down the empty hall. The boundary between them, the one he had drawn so clearly, was beginning to blur. It was a terrifying, exhilarating feeling. She was beginning to see the man behind the ice, and she feared he was beginning to see the woman behind the brand. The arrival of the King's High Council shattered the fragile peace of their routine. They came with the first break in the storm, a procession of grim-faced lords in dark, expensive furs. Their leader was a man with a face like a hawk and eyes like chips of flint. Lord Valerius, the king's chief advisor. Alara recognized him instantly. The blood in her veins turned to ice. It was him. The cold, clever magistrate from her village. The man who had branded her. She saw him in the great hall, standing at the king's right hand. His gaze swept the assembled court and servants, and for a heart-stopping moment, his eyes met hers. A flicker of recognition, a flash of something cold and calculating. He looked away as if he had seen nothing, but she knew. He remembered. The whispers in the castle grew louder. Valerius was skilled at planting seeds of dissent. He spoke of ancient laws, of the sanctity of the king's companion. He didn't need to name her. Everyone knew who the branded witch was, the one who had ensnared the noble Kale. Kalen ignored the council's veiled warnings. His nightly visits to her room continued, though they were shorter now, more fraught with tension. He seemed more guarded, the ice reforming around him. "They want you gone," he said one night, his voice flat. He was staring out her small window at the moonlit snow. "I know," she replied quietly. "The storm has passed. I should leave." The words tasted like ash. The thought of returning to her cold, lonely existence was a physical pain. "No." The word was absolute. She looked up at him, shocked. "But you said—" "I know what I said," he interrupted, turning to face her. The moonlight caught in his silver hair, making him look ethereal, otherworldly. "Kale will not leave you. Therefore, you will not leave." It was a statement of logic, a possessiveness born of necessity, not emotion. or so he tried to make it seem. But she saw the conflict in his eyes, the war between his duty and something else. Something he refused to name. Valerius, seeing that his whispers were not enough, escalated his campaign. A precious silver goblet from the king's own table went missing. A thorough search, instigated by Valerius, found it tucked beneath the thin mattress of Ilara's cot. She was dragged before the king and his council in the throne room. The hall was silent, the air thick with condemnation. "The punishment for theft is the loss of a hand which," Valerius said, his voice dripping with righteous satisfaction. He looked at the king. "The law is clear, your majesty." Ilara stood straight, her hands bound before her. She would not beg. "I did not take it," she said, her voice clear and steady, though her heart felt like a trapped bird. She looked directly at Kalin, who sat on his throne of black basalt, his face an unreadable mask. At her feet, Kale rose and let out a low, guttural growl, his eyes fixed on Valerius. The advisor took an involuntary step back. Kalen's gaze shifted from Ilara to the wolf, and then to Valerius. A long, agonizing silence stretched. "The matter is dismissed," the king said at last, his voice echoing in the hall. A collective gasp went through the room. Valerius's face contorted in disbelief. "But sire, the evidence, the law." "My wolf is a better judge of character than any law you can quote, my lord," Kalin said, his voice lethally soft. "He has vouched for her. That is the end of it. Release her." The guards cut her bonds. As she rubbed her chafed wrists, she saw the look on Valerius's face. It was not just anger. It was the cold, hard certainty of a man who, having failed to remove an obstacle, had decided to destroy it completely. But the obstacle he now saw was not her. It was the king himself. The threat had changed. It was no longer about her past catching up with her. It was about Valerius securing his future, and the king, blinded by his growing, unspoken feelings for her, was standing in his way. The blow came 2 nights later. It was the night of the winter feast, a formal affair to celebrate the end of the long storm. The great hall was filled with lords and ladies, the air thick with the scent of roasted meat and mulled wine. Ilara was serving, keeping to the shadows, her eyes constantly scanning for Valerius. She saw him approach the king, offering a special goblet of wine, a vintage reserved for the Alpha himself. He spoke of loyalty, of celebrating the king's strength. Kalin, distracted by a question from another lord, accepted the cup and drank deeply. Valerius smiled, a thin, triumphant curve of his lips. He caught Ilara's eye across the hall, and in that moment, she knew. She saw the victory in his gaze, the finality. A moment later, the king faltered. He swayed on his feet, his hand going to his chest. The silver goblet clattered to the floor. A gasp rippled through the crowd. "Your Majesty?" a lord asked, reaching out to steady him. Kalin pushed the hand away. A strange crystalline frost was beginning to creep across the back of his hand, branching out like ice on a winter pane. "Cold," he rasped, his voice tight with pain. Kyle, who had been lying by the hearth, shot to his feet with a terrifying howl of agony. It was not a sound of aggression, but of shared pain, a cry that echoed the torment of his master. Chaos erupted. The king collapsed to his knees, his body racked with violent shivers. The frost was spreading, climbing up his arms, turning his skin a deathly, translucent white. "It's the witch!" Valerius's voice cut through the panic. "She has poisoned him! I saw her near the wine casks. Seize her!" Guards converged on her. Hands grabbed her arms, rough and unforgiving. She struggled. Her eyes locked on Kalin, who was now on the floor, his breath coming in shallow, frosty puffs. The cold radiating from him was palpable, a supernatural chill that made the very air ache. "No!" she screamed. "It was him! It was Valerius!" But no one was listening. They saw a dying king and a branded witch. The conclusion was simple, inevitable. They started to drag her away, toward the dungeons, toward her death. She fought, kicking and twisting, her gaze fixed on the spreading ice that was consuming the man she had, to her own astonishment, come to care for. This was it. The lowest point. He was dying. The entire world believed she was his killer. Despair, cold and absolute, threatened to swallow her whole. Suddenly, a silver blur shot through the chaos. Kale, moving with a speed and ferocity no one could have anticipated, slammed into the guards holding her. They went flying, crashing into tables and scattering terrified nobles. The wolf stood over her, snarling, a wall of fur and teeth between her and the entire court. He nudged her, his wet nose pressing insistently against her hand, urging her toward the king. There was a desperate intelligence in his eyes, a plea. He knew. He knew she was the only one who could help. Ignoring the shouts and drawn swords, Alara scrambled to Kalen's side. He was barely conscious, his lips blue, his skin like marble. The frost had reached his neck, intricate patterns of ice creeping toward his face. The room had grown impossibly cold, the great hearth fires seeming to shrink away from the arctic chill emanating from his body. "Get away from him, witch!" Valerius commanded, his face a mask of false outrage. Alara ignored him. She reached out a trembling hand, hesitating just above his frozen chest. She remembered the strange, faint warmth that had always lived in her palms. A secret she had guarded and suppressed her entire life for fear of being called what they had called her anyway. Witch. What was the point in hiding now? He was dying. She had nothing left to lose. She pressed her hands flat against the icy plate of his tunic. The cold was shocking, a pain that shot up her arms, so intense it felt like a burn. But beneath the magical frost she could feel the faint, fading flutter of his heart. She closed her eyes, pouring every ounce of her will, her fear, her desperation into her touch. She thought of the warmth of the wolf's fur, the heat of the fire in the cave, the small, secret flame of hope he had kindled in her own frozen heart. She refused to let him go. She would not let this cold, lonely man die. "Live," she screamed in the silence of her mind. "Please, live." And then it happened. A soft golden light began to glow from beneath her palms. It was faint at first, a mere suggestion of light, but it grew rapidly, intensely. A wave of heat, pure and powerful, erupted from her, pushing back the unnatural cold. The frost on Kalen's chest sizzled and vanished. The light intensified, engulfing them both, a miniature sun in the center of the great hall. The brand on the back of her neck flared with an unbearable heat, a searing, cleansing fire. She cried out, not in pain, but in sheer, overwhelming release. She felt something inside her shatter, a dam breaking, and a torrent of power, of life, of pure, untamed warmth flooded through her. The light exploded outwards, a visible wave of golden energy that swept through the room. The ice on the walls cracked. The shivering nobles gasped as a profound warmth washed over them. The very stones of the castle seemed to sigh in relief. When the light faded, she was left kneeling, gasping for breath, her hand still on Kalen's chest. The frost was gone. All of it, all. His skin was no longer marble white but flushed with life. The place on her neck where the brand had been was now smooth, unmarked skin. The lie had been burned away by the truth of what she was. Kalen's eyes shot open. He took a deep, shuddering breath, a real breath, not a frozen gasp. His ice-blue eyes, now clear and sharp, found hers. He looked at her, and for the first time she saw no ice in them at all, only awe. He reached up, his hand covering hers on his chest. His touch was warm, alive. "You," he breathed, his voice raw. The internal winter he had carried for centuries, the cold that had defined his existence, was gone. In its place was a quiet, steady warmth that originated from her. "She's a monster," Valerius shrieked, his plan in ruins, his face pale with terror and rage. He drew a dagger from his belt. "A demon in human form. Kill her before she destroys us all." He lunged, not at the king, but at her. He never made it. Kalen was on his feet in a single fluid motion, his strength returned tenfold. His power, once cold and brittle, now flowed like a river of molten silver. He caught Valerius's wrist in an iron grip, twisting until the dagger clattered to the floor. "I was poisoned." Kalen's voice was dangerously calm, yet it carried to every corner of the silent hall. "With frost viper venom, refined to mimic death. A rare poison. A poison, I recall, you showed an alchemical interest in, Lord Valerius." Valerius's eyes widened in panic. Lies. It was her sorcery. "Was it?" Kalen asked softly. He leaned in close. "Kale smelled it on you when you offered me the cup. My wolf is never wrong." He straightened up, his grip on Valerius unrelenting. He looked at Alara, who was slowly getting to her feet, aided by a gentle nudge from the wolf. His gaze was soft, full of a raw emotion that stole her breath. "For 5 years, this woman has been in exile, branded for a crime she did not commit," Kalen announced, his voice ringing with authority. "A crime you sentenced her for, Valerius, to cover the death of your own nephew from a fever you could not cure." The final piece clicked into place. Valerius's face went slack with shock. He had orchestrated everything from the very beginning. "She is not a witch," Kalen continued, his eyes never leaving Alara's. "She is a healer. She is life. And you tried to extinguish her." He turned his chilling gaze back to the terrified advisor. "You threatened the heart of this kingdom. You threatened my queen." The last 2 words fell into the silence like thunder. "Queen." He shoved Valerius toward the guards. "Take him to the deepest dungeon. He will await my judgment." As the traitor was dragged away, screaming curses, Kalen walked to Alara. The entire court watched, breathless. He stopped before her, so close she could feel the new, living warmth of him. He gently reached out and touched the back of her neck, where the brand had been. His fingers traced the smooth, healed skin. "I am sorry," he whispered, for her ears only. "For what they did to you. For what I almost let them do." "You saved me," she whispered back, her eyes welling with tears. A sad, beautiful smile touched his lips for the first time. "No, Ilara. You saved me." He took her hand, lifting it to his lips. "You thawed me." He turned to the court, his voice booming with a power and vitality no one had heard from him in a century. "This is Ilara, of no house, and of all houses, the woman who brought life back to my soul and to these lands. She is my mate, my queen. If any object, they can take their concerns to my dungeons and join Lord Valerius." No one objected. They simply stared, first at their vibrant, living king, and then at the small woman with the glowing eyes who stood beside him, her hand held firmly in his. She was no longer worthless, no longer invisible. She was seen. She was chosen. She was home. Spring came to the Icelands. It was not the slow, grudging thaw of years past. This was a true awakening. Rivers that had been frozen for generations broke free with a mighty roar. Hillsides that had known only snow and rock burst forth with carpets of purple and white mountain flowers. The air itself felt different, softer, filled with the scent of damp earth and new life. 6 months had passed. The black stone of the fortress no longer felt like a tomb. Bright tapestries now hung on the walls, depicting not battles and conquests, but fields of flowers and soaring eagles. Fires burned in every hearth, not for desperate warmth, but for cheer. Laughter could be heard in the corridors, a sound that had been absent for a decade. Ilara stood on the high balcony of the royal chambers, a soft breeze playing with her hair. She wore a simple gown of deep green, but on her finger was a ring of woven silver, a gift from the king. She rested a hand on her gently swelling abdomen, a quiet smile on her face. The life magic that had erupted from her that day now flowed gently, a constant, warm river within her. She had been learning to use it, not for dramatic rescues, but for small miracles. She helped the castle gardeners coax stubborn roses from the thawed soil. She laid her hands on the ancient barren apple trees in the royal orchard, and within a week, they had blossomed. She was not just a healer of people, she was a healer of the land. The land, so long mirroring its king's frozen heart, was now mirroring hers. Strong arms wrapped around her from behind, a familiar chin rested on her shoulder. "What does my queen see?" Kaylin's voice was a low, warm murmur against her ear. It was a voice that no longer held the chill of 1,000 winters. "I see life," she answered, leaning back against his solid warmth. "So much life." Below them, in the courtyard, Kyle was chasing a flock of birds, leaping and bounding with the joyful energy of a young pup. The great, solemn wolf was gone, replaced by a creature of pure, unadulterated happiness. He was no longer just the king's soul, a reflection of his master's pain. He was a part of their family, a bridge that had brought them together, now free to simply be. "It is your doing," Kaylin said, his hand coming to rest over hers on her stomach. He felt the small life stirring within. "All of it. You woke us all up." She turned in his arms to face him. The harsh lines of his face had softened over the months. The ice in his eyes had melted completely, leaving a blue as clear and deep as a summer sky. He looked at her with a love so profound, it still sometimes made her ache. "We woke each other up," she corrected gently. "I was just as frozen as you were." He knew it was true. He had given her a home, a name, a purpose. He had shattered the cage of worthlessness she had lived in for so long. He saw her not as a branded witch or a powerful healer, but as Ilara, his Ilara. And in his eyes she had finally, truly seen herself. "I love you," he said. The words were not a desperate confession made in the face of death. They were a simple, solid truth, spoken in the warm sunlight of a new day. "I'm saying that I love you, and it's going to save me every day for the rest of my life." "And I love you," she replied, rising on her toes to kiss him. The kiss was not frantic or desperate. It was calm and deep and full of promise. It spoke of quiet mornings and shared laughter, of a future built not on power or duty, but on a love that had been strong enough to melt a kingdom's winter and heal two broken souls. They were no longer the lonely king and the banished witch. They were a new beginning, a promise of spring, standing together at the heart of their new, vibrant world.